Appalachian Harvest is a food hub located in Southwest Virginia that provides regional herb and vegetable farmers with training, technical support, aggregation, and distribution services, connecting them to retail markets. We currently source produce from farmers in Virginia, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, and North Carolina. This webinar is made possible by Risk Management Agency 2018 Risk Management Education Partnership Program.
Hello and welcome to the sessions on weeds, controlling the pesky plants. My name is Scott Gerald. I'm an agricultural extension agent in Scott County, Virginia. And what I intend to cover in the meeting is defining what a weed is, why weeds are such a concern, and organic options for weed control. So what is a weed? A weed is a plant that grows in a place where it is not wanted. We can look at any plant, whether it be a flower, whether it be another crop plant, and if it is growing in a place where we do not want it, then it is considered to be a weed. And a weed is nothing more than a plant that takes advantage of any unused resources that are made available by our cropping practices. If we think about how we farm, nutrient availability is usually high at the beginning of the season and then decreases during the season. Water availability also depends on weather patterns for that particular year, but it's typically higher at the beginning of the season and lower at the end. Light under the crop canopy that's available for weeds is high at the beginning, fairly low in the middle, and generally high again at the end of the season when crop leaves are senescing and dropping. Knowing the ecology or the germination and growth periods of the weeds that are particular to your farm is key in organic weed management, as this is how we're going to develop a plan for controlling the weeds that we have all season long. So why are weeds such a concern? Well, first of all, they harbor potential for insects and other pests and diseases. But the other thing we have to look at is they compete also for sunlight, for water, and for nutrients. With that, weeds can be an issue in any of the cultivated fields that we are using. When we cultivate land, we create an extremely unstable and unpredictable environment. Weeds tend to flourish in these disturbed lands, and it occurs as part of an ecological succession. So as we cut plants down, other plants are inevitably going to try to come back as nature tries to restore stability within itself and to protect the bare soil as a first step. Since the bare soil is highly unstable, annual weeds are then the natural start of this progression. They do well in these type of conditions because annual weeds are usually hardy, they're short-lived, and they're prolific seed producers. Because most of these weeds that we look at are annual, they compete for the same thing as an annual crop does: sunlight, water, and nutrients. In addition to these things, they can carry over potentially destructive pests and diseases that will increase the chances of our crop being a failure. They also increase our labor expenses and our overall expense on the farm. In addition to harboring pests, diseases, and competing for nutrients, sunlight, and water, the weeds can impact the finances on the farm because we're having to increase our labor expense to mechanically remove the weeds. It can slow the harvest process, or it can reduce the quality of the vegetables due to the physical injuries to the marketable product, or from a smaller size and reduced quality due to competition for the necessary inputs. In either case, we're spending additional money that's either not required or we don't necessarily see the lost money due to the excessive weed pressure that we have in some of these fields. Now, when we look at the weeds and we see the reasons behind why we should want to control them, we have to look at some of the organic weed management principles. We must understand the weed biology and the physiology, how this plant grows, what its reproduction cycle is, what its life cycle is, whether it's a grass or whether it's a broadleaf. And then we can look at the multiple options to control each one of these types of weeds. And we have to understand that this is going to be a continuous effort as we control the weeds in organic culture. So as we look at annuals, biennials, and perennials, knowing the reproductive and the life cycle of these plants allows us to plan for optimal times to control these weeds. Annuals are going to germinate from seed. They complete their growth cycle in 1 year. Then they produce seeds and die. Biennials will germinate. They grow into a rosette the first year. They overwinter. Then they bolt and produce seed the second year. Perennials continue to regenerate growth year after year from nutrient reserves that they have stored within the plant or the plant roots. In most cases, as we move into a cropping system, we create a monoculture of annual plants. Because of this, we create an environment that favors more of these annual weeds. So this dictates how we are going to control the weeds in our crop fields. In organic production, we have to look at an integrated way to implement weed control and understand that this is going to be a continuous effort for us to have satisfactory suppression of the weeds. To have satisfactory weed control, we have to know what type of options are available to us in the organic setting. We can look at preventative measures, cultural, mechanical, biological, and chemical. Unfortunately, in organic production, chemical options are very limited in the early stages of production. These organic options utilized for weed control needs to follow some type of integrated approach that's going to start with proper planning. And that's how we prevent the weeds from growing and becoming established. Cultural controls is how do we control the growing condition to limit seed germination or its growth. Mechanical controls go into the tools that we have available to mechanically remove weeds without causing harm to the cultivated crop. Biological would be any natural predator or pest of the weed that would kill the germinating plant or prevent it from completing a life cycle and reproducing seeds. And finally, after all of these other control measures have not adequately controlled the weeds, and there's an expectation that there's going to be a negative impact on the crop, we should look at the forms of chemical control available to us as organic producers. Let's go a little bit further into each one of these 5 different control options that's available to us. When we look at preventative controls, again, that's any control method that we can use to prevent weeds from becoming established. In particular, if we're establishing a cover crop or if we're buying crop seed, we want to make sure that we buy certified weed-free seed. By being certified, it means that they have been tested to make sure that there's proper germination, that there's good growth potential in those plants, and that we're not hijacking our own operation by having weed seeds incorporated in with the seed that we are purchasing. While other non-certified seed sources may offer us a cheaper option, they don't necessarily have higher germination rates. They're not going to be as growthy, and they're not going to be potentially weed-free. The other option we need to look at is cleaning our farm equipment. If we use our equipment for multiple options on the farm, maybe bush hogging, mowing hay, things of that nature, understand that those weed seeds can become impacted on the farm equipment themselves. A quick power wash can remove a majority of those seeds and can keep us from planting those seeds that's come from other weeds on the farm into our cultivated crop fields. If we're also looking at mulching, make sure that the mulch that we use does not have seeds in it. If it's hay or if it's straw, we do not want mature seeds in there that would germinate and cause us more problems after we've applied that mulch. Cultural controls are how we maintain field conditions where weeds are less likely to become established or to increase in their numbers. And we can look at different options like crop rotation. We can try to lightly disturb the soil. We can use transplants instead of seeds in our vegetable production. We want to choose well-adapted varieties that are good for both our region and the soil type and our management. We want to increase plant density where we can get a canopy over those bare soil areas as quickly as possible to shade out any newly germinating weeds. We can also utilize living cover crops or mulch, and we want to make sure that we maintain good soil fertility. We cannot expect a crop to grow well if the nutrients are not there for it to outcompete the weeds with to begin with. So cultural control, it gives us the option to maintain conditions where the weeds are less likely to become established. By modifying how we grow this crop, it disrupts the monoculture system and allows us to become more diverse. It creates more options for weed control, such as using a smother crop during a crop rotation period. By using a thick, robust crop that's going to quickly grow and choke out the weeds, we're using this as a method to minimize the annual growth and seed production of the weed. We also are looking at options like conservation, minimum tillage, or no tillage, so as to avoid aggressively disturbing the soil or having bare soil for weeds to germinate between the rows. In addition to minimally disturbing the soil, we have found that plants such as rye have an allelopathic effect on weed seeds. And what that means is the plant produces seed-inhibiting chemicals as they decay, and it can be used to suppress weed growth between our rows. If it's possible, we need to use transplants to give the crop a head start and allow those plants to develop a shading canopy between the plants and between the rows, which is going to minimize sunlight for weed growth. Choosing the best variety for your location, your management style, and your soil are also key in the cultural control. Varieties that don't perform well in either our climate or the soil type are going to be hindered in growth. They're going to produce crops that can't compete to well-adapted weeds. And by increasing plant density, we allow the crop to cover the bare soil surface more quickly and shade out any late germinating weed seeds. If we were to choose a living cover crop, we need to choose something that's both dense and low growing or easily managed, so it gives us an alternative to bare ground. Planting these crops, allowing it to germinate, and then planting another managed crop between the rows can add stability to the soil, it can reduce runoff and erosion, and it will lessen the competition from weeds. If we have a living cover that we are utilizing, take into account that there's going to be additional resources that are needed in the form of water and nutrients in addition to what crop we're growing. Soil fertility is also the capacity of our soil to provide crops with the essential plant nutrients. This can be influenced by natural factors such as the parent material of the soil where it was formed, the climate and the topography, the age, the physical condition of the soil, and the microorganisms that are present there. It can also be influenced by other factors of nutrient losses, such as continued removal of nutrients by both crops or weeds, losses due to erosion or leaching, losses of nitrogen through denitrification, or concreting or immobilization of nutrients due to pH imbalances. If these nutrients are lost or if they're unavailable, actions have to be taken for an adequate crop growth or before adequate crop growth will occur. One of the great things about the state of Virginia is the money you spend on a soil test is some of the best that you'll ever spend. They're free. With that soil sample, what it does is it gives us an indication of what the pH of that soil is. It also gives us an indication of the phosphorus, the potassium, and other micro and macronutrients that are going to be available based on the pH and the condition of the soil that it's in. Fertility recommendations can then be personalized for each field and for each crop based on this analysis. Regardless of whether you use organic or conventional nutrient sources, the plant still must have adequate available nutrition for the crop you're producing to be successful. We can also look at mechanical controls of how to control these weeds with the equipment that we have available. So mechanical control involves using any tool that we might have for the control of these weeds. They can be as simple as tillage implements like hoes and tillers, spring tines, rotary discs, or spiders, all the way up to specialty high residue cultivators. Mowing can be achieved by weed eaters, lawn mowers, and rotary or flail mowers, but care should be taken not to allow too much growth to occur so that plant juices are going to wet the leaves of the crop, potentially increasing the chance of disease. In addition to the plant juices, if we have a heavy residue that's left, it can also harbor potentially harmful diseases as that organic matter decomposes. Flaming is probably one of the least used implements that we have, but it also requires the highest skill set to use it appropriately. Flaming can be used on stale beds, and basically we are burning or scorching the weeds prior to a crop planting. But we do not want to get the soil hot enough that we're going to kill microbes in the process also. We can also use a flamer post-seed, but prior to germination. Or they've also been developed where we can use them between rows as a directed flame. One of the things with these flame control methods is it requires a plant that is less than 2 to 3 inches tall and still tender for it to be effective. The way that this works is it literally cooks the leaves, bringing the sap up to a temperature that it disrupts the cell membrane and causes death to that tissue. But care has to also be taken not to damage nearby plants if we're using it between row, or to get the temperature high enough that we kill that seed or the germinating seedling if we've already planted the crop. It also takes a little bit of understanding the method, the type of flame that's being produced, and how hot it gets so we can adjust both the tractor speed and the fuel to balance for an adequate kill. Probably one of the most least used methods of weed control in organics are biological controls. If we look at biological controls, it's choosing natural enemies of weeds. So we can look at both insects or diseases that are plant specific, and in some instances we find folks using grazing animals such as sheep, geese, or chickens. Due to good agricultural practices, we know that we should not allow animals in the field while we're growing the crops to eliminate the potential for contamination. And while there are specific microorganisms and insects that are going to specifically target an enemy weed, the application of these biological controls are not widely used for weed control, but are more commonly used in insect control. We use things like BT or Bacillus thuringiensis, lady beetles, parasitic wasps that are going to attack specific insects. Unfortunately, we don't have those same types of methods to control the weeds adequately in our crop fields. We have had some successes in pasture and hay fields using thistle bugs to be able to attack the rosette of thistles and disrupt seed production. However, those are not common and are not commonly used in vegetable production. When all other courses of action have been exhausted and we're still faced with economically impacting weed infestations, then we need to look at chemical controls. As we're well aware, there's limited numbers of effective organic chemical control options that are available. And two types of controls that are specific are either pre-emergent, which is prior to the weed seed germinating, and post-emergent, which is after the weeds have germinated and emerged above the soil. If we look at pre-emergence, there's two main types that we find. One of them is corn gluten meal, and the other is mustard meal. According to Nick Christians, the professor of horticulture at Iowa State University, corn gluten meal contains protein, fat, and fiber, and a naturally occurring compound in that protein fraction that interferes with root development of a germinating plant. While it doesn't kill the plant directly, it doesn't allow the root to develop at a high enough rate that it can support the water supplies and the nutrient supplies for the plant, so it dehydrates and dies of lack of water in non-irrigated fields. Cinnamon is the compound in white mustard that gives it its pungent flavor, but it also is proved useful in fighting certain weeds. If we look at the rates of what is being used for both corn gluten meal and for the white mustard meals, it's not uncommon to see rates of 1 to 2 tons per acre. And we do see reduction of some of our weeds, such as lamb's quarter, henbit, pigweed, foxtail. Those reductions can be up to 90%. But the problem is not all crops are tolerant to those levels that are needed to suppress the weeds. What I'm trying to say is if we apply it heavy enough to kill weeds, it also may be fatal to the crop that we are trying to grow. Corn gluten meal also doesn't have any effect on weeds that are already established, so it can only be used in a pre-emergent state, as the mustard meal also. The one thing we do need to remember, though, is since they are pre-emergent, they can be applied early enough to try to suppress some of our weedy grasses and annual broadleaf weeds prior to our planting. Post-emergent chemicals can be products such as acetic acid, citric acid, eugenol, and fatty acids. If we look at acetic acid, it's basically an herbicidal strength vinegar. And I get questions a lot of why can't we use regular vinegar? Well, simply because of the way that pesticides are regulated in the United States. If it does not have a label for an herbicide use, it cannot be used for that purpose. Citric acid comes from our citrus fruit. Eugenol is clove oil, and fatty acids are also being described as herbicidal oils also. Some of the benefits are that they're effective if they're applied at the appropriate rate, the appropriate time, and the appropriate state of growth on certain annual weeds. Some of the downsides to these chemical controls is that they do come in more higher concentration forms. And because of that, these are acids. They can still cause damage to humans. So we do need to make sure that we protect our skin and our eyes when we are mixing these products and applying these products. The other thing is most of these have little to no control of perennial weeds, and they're what we call non-selective. They will kill whatever it is they touch. So they don't have any residual activity to kill other weeds that may be lying underneath the soil surface. So as we put all these things together and we look at controlling the weeds on our farm, it's a continuous effort. Weeds are one of the few things that we can count on year after year as being an issue in our fields. Regardless of the message that we've been discussing, we have to look at weed control as a continual effort that's in all stages, and in particular the critical times of a production season. During the initial phase of tillage and prior to crop establishment, weeds must be controlled as they can compete with both nutrients and water resources. They can become established and potentially choke out the crop. And before the canopy closes, we have to control weeds that would compete with both sunlight, water, and nutrients as they grow taller. Additionally, if we have aggressively growing weeds, they may overtake and choke out tender, newly established vegetables. It can quickly form a canopy and shades and prohibits both sunlight quantity and quality from reaching our crops. This results in a stress that's being placed on the plant, where photosynthesis is slowed. There's an increase in auxin production for shoot elongation as it searches for sunlight, and we find that we have tall, spindly, and usually non-thrifty plants if it makes it past that weed canopy. Because of that, these plants are easily lodged, blown over, and cannot physically hold the weight of some of the crops that we're growing. What we must continually do is be vigilant of what weeds that we have. We have to understand the pressure that's placed on our crops and the most appropriate method of control that we're going to employ. So when we look at our own weed management plan, each producer has to decide on what their best management practice is going to be for their specific farm. Some of this includes the amount of time, the labor, and the thresholds that we're willing to accept. It would be easy for us if there was just a one-size-fits-all approach where we could recommend an herbicide for a specific weed pressure, like a doctor prescribes a medicine for their patients. And while it's more common for us to do this in conventional agriculture, and it can be relatively effective there, we don't have those same chemistries and capabilities for organic production. As a result, what we need to do is look at a more integrated approach and develop a weed management plan that uses our past experiences, the scouting of the fields, and our anticipated weather, whether it's wet or dry, hot or cold, to determine how to best limit the weed growth that we have in our organic crops. When we look at our weed management plan, we need to ask ourselves some questions. What weeds are going to give us the most problem early in the season? We need to determine the practices that are going to reduce these weeds prior to our planting. We need to use good genetics or transplants for quick early season growth. We need to determine the appropriate control measures and what the scheduling or timing of those control measures are going to be. We have to estimate the threshold levels of acceptable weed presence and when they may cause us economic damage. And then, as the last resort, employ appropriate organic herbicides when all of our other methods have failed and the thresholds for damage are met. As I went through this program, it's not easy for me to put together what I would call a good integrated method of weed control for organic producers, simply because you're extremely limited based on the type of plant you're growing, your location, and what methods of control are available to you. But I hope that by looking at an integrated approach, by thinking about this early in the season, it will give you an opportunity to have a head start on how to control potentially invasive weeds in your crops this year. If you have any questions, you can contact me at the information that I have listed below.